And joining us to discuss Africa's migrants is Calestis Juma. He's a professor of the practice of international development at Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Juma, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Professor Juma, with all the focus on Syrian refugees or migrants, what happens to the plight of African migrants? Do you think they've been neglected or ignored?
I think they're being overshadowed because of the military conditions in Syria. African migration into Europe has been a major issue over the last decade. And this has been going on. It's been a challenge, but I think it's now being overshadowed by the events in Syria at the moment.
Well, where are the majority of these Africans fleeing from?
The majority of them come from countries such as Eritrea, Nigeria, the Gambia, Senegal, the Sudan, and Somalia.
And what are the reasons that they're leaving? Sudan had a civil war, a lot of unrest in Darfur, but most of the other countries seem to be relatively politically stable.
I think one has to look at the roots of the flight back in history, in that these are young people who were born at a periods of crisis in their own countries, like in Ivory Coast and others that have been going through a conflict. So we're looking at the impact of events that took place, say, 2 decades or more ago.
And where are they headed to? Are they aiming to get to Europe, or are they aiming for other African countries for the most part?
I think it's a combination of both. There's a lot of intra-African migration that is taking place, and then some of those who are moving from one African country to another end up becoming part of the human trafficking networks. Niger, for example, has been a major transit point for migrants from West Africa who are moving into North Africa with the hope of getting into Europe.
And what are the economic costs for the countries that are now having to deal with the issue of absorbing these migrants?
I think it's a major burden for Europe, both psychologically and economically, to a point where we are starting to see fences being erected, major concerns about the possibility of integrating these refugees. So it is a serious global challenge at the moment.
Do you think that these African migrants are viewed differently than the Syrian migrants in Europe?
I think they are viewed differently, partly because of differences in levels of education, possibilities of getting integrated. Some of the Muslim migrants can convert to Christianity. It's rather difficult for a black African to convert to being white.
Indeed, but it's not a matter of racism necessarily, because we've seen African countries reject African migrants. In South Africa, there's been a lot of xenophobia from South Africans to other Africans trying to come in and find work in the South African economy, which is relatively thriving on the African continent. So is that the issue? Does it all boil down to economic opportunities and protecting those?
I think it comes down to that, but when it comes to integration, you have differences in the way different races get integrated in other countries. But I think you are right. Fundamentally, what the real concern here is economic opportunities, and that's the main reason why many young Africans are on the move. It's a delayed response to a failure on the part of Africans to have accounted for the fact that they have the youngest population in the world that is looking for opportunities.
Well, it's indeed a big issue. European and African leaders are attending a summit in November, which is aimed at dealing with the migrant crisis. And Professor Juma, experts say that any solution must look at the lack of economic opportunities, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. What do you think? What are the policies that are needed to be implemented to try and fix this?
I think there are 3 areas that require immediate attention. One is really expanding employment opportunities for the young people. This may come from, say, investment in infrastructure projects that can mop up a lot of the young people. The second is giving them technical skills. Many of these are young people who have received education that has not prepared them for anything, but give them aspirations to migrate and go somewhere with the hope of getting a job. And I think the third one is Africa itself needs to liberalize mobility among African countries so that not everybody who crosses a border is actually a refugee.
All right. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Calestis Juma, Professor of the Practice of International Development at Harvard Kennedy School.